All right. Hi, everybody. So we are going to start our conversation about JavaScript. So the next and sort of the third, the last big component in the stack of technologies for the front end of the web, right? So we have HTML, CSS, JavaScript. HTML, we talked about this, takes care of the structure, right? Information architecture, if you will, of your page, and it takes care of the meaning, right? So it assigns meaning to certain components. Like you can take a piece of text and say, this is a header, right? Or you can take another piece of text and not just a header, but like header one, right? So the most important header. Or you can take another piece of text and say that this is going to be an article, right? And then another piece of text that is going to be part of the footer or something like that, right? So so HTML, CSS takes care of your visual presentation, right? So that includes layout, visual structure, right? It includes typography, it includes colors, and so on, right? CSS is very powerful. We only dipped our toes a little bit in the previous video into what it can do, right? There's like a massive, massive conversation about what are some of the things you can do with CSS. Um, so I encourage you to take a look and explore it on your own. But now we're going to move on to the third component, which is JavaScript, right? So JavaScript is a scripting language, right? So for the, again, grossly simplifying, like the big difference between scripting languages and programming languages, and again, it's not entirely true about JavaScript, and it's like there are all kinds of subtleties and variations, but the big difference is that scripting languages exist within a certain context, right? Let's say a browser or an operating system, and they are basically a collection of commands that you use in order to modify the behavior of that system, right? So for example, we have JavaScript to modify the behavior of a browser, right? You have kind of standard behaviors, and then you can add on top of this or change them somehow, maybe automate some of the processes, right? You have other scripting languages and other systems. So for example, you have something like Bash script or Apple script that will change the behavior of, for example, your Mac OS operating system, right? If you're in a Mac, right? There are all kinds of scripting languages that exist in that sense, right? The difference between, again, simplifying, but the difference between scripting language and a programming language is a programming language fundamentally needs to be compiled, right? So you write a program and then it kind of gets converted into ones and zeros, right? And those ones and zeros are ultimately what's going to be sent to the central processing unit or graphics processing unit, and they're the ones that are going to control the operations of this machinery and create the outcome, right? So it's kind of like a thing on its own that kind of sits as its own like um, application in the system, right? Whether it's an actual app or a program or like a little applet, if you will. But regardless, it's a thing on its own, and it's going to get it, and it gets converted and gets executed on the processor. Whereas scripting language, right, it just modifies the behavior of another program, right? So hence the name JavaScript, for example, right? Like original, some of those the browsers were written in Java language, and the script was used to modify the behavior of something that was written in Java language. So it was script that modified the behavior of a program written in Java. Right? The official name is not even JavaScript; it's CCMA script. But that all of that aside, let's get our hands dirty. Let's see what we can do with JavaScript. All right, so last time we left off, we had our website kind of like this. It was one page, right? And we had sections and we added some CSS and we kind of structured it and made it responsive. So we had a good look at the inspection panel, right? So here it is. And we learned how to work with a responsive um, mode, right? So here is a responsive mode demo and so on, right? Now we're going to move on from the inspector to console right here, right? So sometimes some of the browsers offer you to open console in the same tab as the inspector. I prefer to have it separately, right? But console is essentially a window where you can issue JavaScript commands, right? Execute JavaScript commands that will ultimately change the behavior of your browser, or will be processed by the browser with predictable results, right? So this is the simplest, the easiest. Well, not the simplest, not the easiest. I don't know, the most direct, the most straightforward way of interacting with the browser, right? You don't even have to write any JavaScript in your HTML page, which we will see how we can do that, or in its own separate file. All you have to do is just issue commands to the browser, right? And it will execute them. So what are some of the commands that you can issue? Well, there are tons of them, right? And actually, like, crazy amount of things that you can do. So we are gonna only take, again, just a brief look at some of the things that you can do. And so it's gonna be maybe just an introductory overview, right? So we're not gonna get into like overview of the entire thing. So I highly encourage you to explore it on your own. But for us, let's start slow, right? Like, some of the things that we can do. We can, as a programming language, right? Programming or scripting language, right? Programming, scripting, computers usually associated with numbers. You can do arithmetic, basic arithmetic. It can be helpful, right, in certain cases. So I'll show you in a little bit how it can be helpful, right? So let's do something like this. We can take a number, let's say 10, right? And we can add another number to it, 1, and we get 11 as the outcome, right? That's great. I can, just the same way, I can actually add 2 pieces of text together, right? So the number, you notice, is highlighted in blue, and the result is highlighted in green, right? So if I put a piece of text, I would need to add quotation marks. And let's say I have a piece of text that says hello, right? And then space, right? So hello, space, and then another piece of text that I'm going to add to it, and it's going to be world, right? So as a result, we get hello world, right? So notice that while 11 was in green, hello world is in black. That means that it's a different kind of thing, for the lack of a better word, in the scripting language. So official terms are 11 in this case is an integer, right? And hello world is a string of text. It's a string of text or string of characters, right? Strung together to form a phrase. So we can add integers. We can add things with decimal points too, right? We can say 10 plus 2.3, and we get 12.2.3. 12.3, right? So again, a number, also going to be in green. So we can add things like this. We can add strings and integers, right? It's going to be interesting to observe it. So for example, what would say 10 plus world, right? We can do that. This is a fully allowed operation. So let's see what happens. 10, the number 10 gets converted into a piece of text, and now you get a concatenation of, again, 2 pieces of text. So this would be equivalent to saying 10 plus world. So the important thing to take away here is that JavaScript keeps track of different types of content that you give it. So numbers or strings, or there is another type of content that you can give it, and it's called a Boolean, right? So I can say Boolean is, takes its name after English logician George Boole, and he's the one who sort of like created the mathematical foundations upon which the logic of computers is built, right? So like computers operate on ones and zeros, and so he created the kind of math called Boolean algebra that also operates on or off statements, true or false statements, 1 or 0 statements, right? So like something that's one way or the other way, right? So we can say true, yeah, true, right? True is a statement, and I can say true plus 10, right? So true plus 10 is 11. Why? Because true actually is 1. And if I say false plus 10, you got 10 because false is 0. So true is 1, false is 0. So JavaScript does this like weird on the fly conversion of your content types, right? Booleans get converted to numbers, numbers get converted to strings. Um, it's a peculiar feature of JavaScript. A lot of other programming languages or scripting languages don't work like this. They don't convert um, types of variables. Um, Without going too far into why it happens like this, I just wanted to point that out and just tell you to pay attention to something like this because it sometimes does lead to unexpected results, right? JavaScript is what's known as a weakly typed language, right? We'll look at variables in just a second, but what that means is it doesn't necessarily care about what kind of content you throw at it, right? What type of content you throw at it. It just kind of, right, doesn't have a strong preference. That's why it's weakly typed, or doesn't have a strong sort of insistence on like, oh, you have to only give me a number and a number if you want to add the two things together. You can give me a number and a string of text and I'll just convert it, right, to, and it kind of makes its own assumptions and you have to get used to these assumptions. Okay, so in practical terms, weakly typed language means that a variable, right, remember back in sort of like maybe late middle school or early high school days, you probably encountered functions and you probably encountered variables as something that is associated with functions. So we're going to take a look at that, what that means for JavaScript. So a variable is not going to have a specific type. So there are some programming languages, strongly typed programming languages, that will say like, okay, so a variable is a container, right? So if you're going to put something in a container, you have to only put the kind of stuff that the container is meant for, right? So let's take example of kitchen containers, right? So let's say we have one type of container for liquids and another type of container for dried goods. And you cannot put liquids into the dried good container, right? In one paradigm, in a strongly typed paradigm. Liquids are only in liquids containers, dried good are only in the dried goods, right? That's it. JavaScript doesn't care. You can say like, I have a container. You can put liquids in it. If you then pour out the liquid and put some dried goods in it, that's okay too. I don't care, right? So let's look at what variables are in JavaScript and how they work, right? So in some languages, you would say like, oh, integer, my int would equal to like something, right? Or like, since it's an integer, it will be like 10, right? Or whatever other integer. And then if it's a string of text, you would have to say string of my text is equal to hello, right? JavaScript doesn't care. Like I said, the new standard of declaring variables, the one that we're going to be using, is using keywords let and const. Okay, so they used to be the older standard that used var for variables, right? So like saying var my int is equal to 10, right? We don't use this anymore because let and const allow you for slightly better memory allocation, right? So let is the type of variable that will change, that you expect that it will change at some point, right? So you can think about it as a container and you have a label on that container, but then you might pour something out of it and put something else into it, but the label is not going to change, right? So it's just going to be um, whatever is under that label, but it can have different content, right? So for example, you can have a container and you can put the label on it dinner, right? And so whatever is in it, maybe it's lasagna or maybe it's salad, right? It doesn't matter. That's what's for dinner, right? So so that type of variable is declared with let, right? So because it's going to change, and so we're going to say like let something be something else. Const is the type of value that is not going to change, and it's more like just a label, right, that you add to it. So for example, you have a banana, right, and you print out, let's say you have like a little label maker, and you make a label on it that says Johnny's breakfast, right, and you type that, like you put that label on that banana and you put it in the fridge so that Johnny's roommate doesn't take it, right? So that's const, right? That's not going to change. You're not going to take that label and put it on something else, right? That label belongs to that banana, and that banana and that label are together, and they're going to be together, and they're going to go into the trash can together after Johnny eats his breakfast, right? So that type of variable is a const. So if you don't want to remember any of this, if you just want to like just make some stuff happen, you can make everything a let, right? So because JavaScript will spit an error at you saying like, oh, you're trying to change something, but you declare it as a const, whatever, right? And you can't do that, and it will break things, and things are not going to work. So if you want to avoid this, and you want to be on the safe side, and you don't really care about efficient memory allocation and how fast your program runs and all that engineering stuff, you can just make everything a let. Okay, so back to the idea of variables. Let a equal 10, right? So we have a variable called a, and it's 10. Yes, right? So now if I say a, it says 10, okay? And then I can say let a equal 20, right? So sorry, you can't redeclare it. Basically, I already created a container by saying let a, and so you cannot redeclare it. You now just have to operate it. So unconst syntax error, redeclaration of let a. So that's literally the error that you are getting. So if you wanted to put a different value into your variable, you have to say a equals 20 or 10 or something else, right? So you can't say I have a variable called a and it contains number 10, and then I have a variable called a and it contains a number 20, because it will start thinking like, do you want two different variables or do you want the same variable? I don't know what you're trying to tell me. Is it a mistake? So just throw an error. Okay. So speaking of errors, it's great that we got our first error in console. Pay attention to them, read them carefully. They're very helpful. Okay. So if I say a20, now a contains the value of 20. So if I print a, now it's going to be 20, and then I can have another variable, let b equal 2, right? So b is 2, and then if I say a plus b, 22, right? So I can change the content of my variables. That's why they're called variables, right? Constants are constants, variables are variables. And I can operate on my variables. All right, so we have a quick overview of our console, right? You can issue statements, you can get errors, right? Get some feedback, and you can sort of operate your browser that way. We'll come back to it, right? There are other uses for the console. But let's now go into our files and let's create a new page, and let's see what are some of the things that we can do in JavaScript, and sort of like some of the basic or large scale topics. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to create a new file in here, and I'll call it JS-examples, right? So .html, right? It's going to be an HTML file. I'm going to close this. I'm going to close my CSS. And if you remember, we can just start an HTML file by typing exclamation point in your empty HTML, right? If it's the first symbol in an empty HTML file, it will give you this option for an Emmet abbreviation. If you're in VS Code, right? And it will give you this like boilerplate for your document, right? So we are we're gonna give it a title, say what JavaScript can do, right? Something like this. And so we can look at how can we write JavaScript inside our, how can we include JavaScript into our HTML documents, right? So we saw that there are 3 ways to do CSS. There are also kind of 3 ways, but really more like 2 ways of adding JavaScript, right? So we don't. It's really considered a bad practice to write inline JavaScript, like really bad practice. Even though like with CSS you can write inline CSS, right, like injecting it as an attribute into your HTML documents. And there's like maybe 1 or 2 cases where it's actually even justified when you would want to do that. With JavaScript, you really shouldn't be doing this, right? You really shouldn't be adding stuff like adding JavaScript as an attribute to your HTML documents. JavaScript will live either as its own tag, right? And it's a script tag. And inside the script, you can write JavaScript. So boom, it offered me a whole bunch of stuff. I'm not going to write any of this. This is pointless, but I can write my JavaScript here. Typically, you put your script at the end of your body. So like you would have all kinds of HTML here, right? Let's maybe do something like our typical page structure, like where we had header, and then we have a main container, right? And then we have a footer, right? It's your typical sort of page structure. Let's close the footer like this. And so the scripts normally, generally, kind of rule of thumb, would go at the end of body, like after the footer, after everything else, you will load your scripts. The thinking behind it, the reasoning is that you don't want to halt the execution of the page if there is an error in your script or if it's taking a while to load, right? You want some kind of content on your page, right? And if there is something with a script, at least some content will be on the page already, so you're not going to leave your users hanging. There are obviously pros and cons to that, right? Like, what if your page is absolutely dependent on your script, and you don't even want to load it if the script is not loading? And there are strategies to overcome this sort of like delay in loads. But we're gonna take the simple route. We're just gonna say let's put all the scripts at the end of the body, right before the closing of the body tag. So, let's write some JavaScript, right? So we said that we can declare variables. Let's declare some variables. So we're gonna say console let, if I could only type, let a equal 10. Okay. JavaScript doesn't require a semicolon at the end. I actually consciously try not to put semicolons at the end since they're not required. Sometimes I do because it's a habit from other programming languages that do require semicolons. But typically you don't need to do it, right? JavaScript does not require semicolons at the end of the line. All right, so we're gonna have let a equal 10. 10 of what? 10 of doesn't matter what, right? Just 10 of something. So here we go. So now we have a page, we have a variable on that page, right? And we can presumably do something with it. So one thing that you can do that's going to be extremely helpful, so something that you should really start doing from the very beginning, is use the console from inside your written script. So in order to access the console in the browser, right, this one, from inside your written script, you would need to address console, right? And then common format, common phrasing in JavaScript is something called the dot notation, right? So you say console dot, right? And after the dot, you basically have a whole bunch of things that you can do with a console, right? So you can think about console as sort of like an enclosing entity, and it encloses a whole bunch of like operations that you can perform there, right? So different there you can perform different kinds of operations, right? And so here's the helper offering all kinds of things. So if you look at the helper, you can see like you can say assert or count reset or debug or error, right? The most common thing that you're going to see everywhere is going to be console.log. And so that means you're just logging something into the console. You're printing out the value of a variable, for example, into our console, right? So if you print out the value of your variable into a console, it gives you a chance to kind of glimpse at what your JavaScript is doing at any given point, right? So you can also, so this is very useful for debugging, right? So if your script is behaving in a way that's unexpected, you can see, like, you can kind of open the hood and glance under the hood and see like what kind of permutations, for example, your variable is taking, and is it doing what you would expect it to do, or maybe it's doing something else, and that might give you a hint as to how your script is misbehaving, right? So we're going to look at some of those strategies in a little bit, right? You can also add other things like console dot timestamp, right? You can add a timestamp at the end to just kind of give you an idea of when exactly that happened. Maybe that's something that you would want to do. And so there are other things that you can find helpful. All right, so let's open this document, right? So I'm gonna copy the path to this file and then paste this in and load this file. And so right now I have a printout of 10, right? So that's as expected. I think timestamp might be something that I can do, like I'll say print, right? Print, or something that just to give it some kind of a label. Let's reload and layout was forward before this page was fully loaded, whatever. If style sheets are not yet loaded, so basically it's just like a little warning telling you don't worry about it too much. So all right, so we printed stuff into the console. Wonder why timestamp is not working. So one thing you can try and check is you can always issue the same commands in the console. You can do console dot timestamp, or rather timestamp, or can I do something? Nope. All right, so first issue, right? How do you find answers if you encounter something like this? Google it. You just Google it. Let's Google console timestamp and see if we can find the answer. So timestamp is a static method in the console, so you can give it a label and you can give it there you go, right? So like it's perfect. This feature is non-standard, is not on a standard track. So maybe that's why it's not working, right? So if it's not on a standard track, should be supported, right? So one thing that we can always check is like maybe examples. Do we have some examples? Maybe it's time log, and timestamp is not supported. Let's try time log. You can always copy a piece of text and bring it into your own thing and just like, or time log something else, maybe timestamp time log A. Can we do this? Timer 10 doesn't exist. What if we do timestamp A? At this point, I'm like, I'm already just playing around. So never mind. You give me a second. I'll figure it out. All right. Super quick aside, just since I went down this weird road of adding timestamps, which typically I don't do. It actually requires two types of operation in order to add the timestamp. So I'll just show you, not that you are going to be using it a lot, but you basically need to say console time to start the timer, and then you can do console dot time end, and then add a label, right? And then if you do it this way, right, or add like print, right? So it took 0 milliseconds for the timer to run. So we printed out 10, and then we started the timer, print, and then we ended the timer, print. And then it took 0 milliseconds for that timer to run, which is typical, right? Because it's so fast, right? These two lines got executed almost at the same time. And so if you need to measure some performance, you can. But again, don't feel obligated to do that at any given point. The console logging in is the most important and the most commonly used feature. All right, so let's look at some of the things that we can do. First and foremost, we can manipulate our document, right? So we looked at something something like a document object model, right? Like it's basically the ancestry tree. When we talked about CSS, right? Like, so we talked about parents and grandparents and children and siblings and so on and so forth. So ancestry descendant relationships within your HTML document, right? So the official name for it is DOM model, right? So if you go and look up DOM model, or document object model, right? This is what you're going to get. It's basically like an explanation of how the DOM model works. And if you look at some of the images, maybe something like this, right? So at the root, you have a document, and then you have the HTML element, and inside HTML you have a head and a body, and inside the head you have a title, and inside the body you have like an H1 and then an anchor, right? And so all of this is parent and child relationship. So a title is a child of head and a grandchild of HTML, and so on, right? So again, official name for this is document object model, and JavaScript allows you to sort of traverse this document object model and work with those elements. Okay, so what can we do? Let's do this. So let's add a little bit of CSS, and here's for what, and here's the reason. So we're gonna add a style tag, and we're gonna give some space to our header, main, and footer. Because right now, if you look at the inspector panel, our header is 0 pixels tall, our main is 0 pixels tall, and our footer is 0 pixels tall for one very simple reason. They don't have any content. They don't have any content, so they don't occupy any space on the page, right? So let's make all of them, right, occupy some space, right? So let's do header, main, and footer, and you can disregard all of this. We're gonna give them the height of 300 pixels, okay? So now, if I save this and I reload my page, you can see that header, footer, main, they all have 300 pixel. They're all 300 pixels tall. Okay. So another thing I'm going to do for my header, I'm going to give that element an ID. So IDs are super helpful, super useful for JavaScript. And so we're going to give it an ID of, I don't know, my header. I am not very good with coming up with good IDs, and main is going to have an ID, my main element, right? Something like this. Okay. So what's important is that now I can address those elements just the same way I was able to address them from CSS. I can also address them from JavaScript. Okay. So let's remove all of this. We're going to come back to creating variables in just 1 second. So let's see how we can address these elements. We have, again, document object model. If you remember the very, very top node, the one that even can, like, higher up than the HTML is the node called document, right? So you can type in, you can start by, if you want to address an element in your HTML, you need to first address the document overall, right? So I have this, let's reload. I have this main element. Let's try it with this, right? So I have a main element, and you can see the path to it. So it's HTML, body, and then main element with an ID, my main element, right? So if I wanted to address it, I would have to say something like this. In the console, I would have to say document, right? So document takes the entire document, includes HTML, includes body, includes everything else. So I go to the very top level, and then in the document I have an option to say get element by ID. And so this is a function. So a function is basically a collection of actions, right? So there are a lot of actions that are going to happen in order to facilitate this, and they're all under the hood. You don't know what exactly JavaScript is doing, but you know that if you ask for it to get the element by ID and you provide the ID of that element, in this case, it's going to be my main LM, right? So that's the ID that I gave it. And then this will take that ID and it will do whatever it does, and then it will return, that's the official term, that element to you. So if I execute this by pressing enter, right, here's my main element right here, right? So it returned the reference to my main element and printed it out in the console. So interesting thing is that this my main element has this like opening option, right? You can open it up and you can see various properties of that element. So I do believe that Chrome doesn't do that, right? At least didn't do that last time I checked. And so that's one of the reasons why I use Firefox, is because Firefox allows you to look at all of those various properties. So for example, it gives you an option to look at the child nodes, right? Like, so how many children does this element have, and what's the list, right? And you can see that it's a collection, right? Children, HTML collection, length of 0. It doesn't have any children, right? But if it did, it would have children. And they would all be listed here, right? It has a height of that element listed here, client height. It has the width of that element called client width, and so on and so forth, right? Like all kinds of various properties associated with that element, right? That will come very useful very soon, right? So, but since this is a reference, right? Like, so when I point to it, I highlight that element in my HTML page, so I can take that reference and I can store it in my variable. So if I go back to my page, I'm going to say let main E, right? I'm going to give it a name, and I'm specifically giving it a name that's different from the ID to point out the difference between the ID and the variable within which we store the reference to the element with that ID, right? And I'm going to say document dot get element by ID, and I'm going to provide the ID of my main element. Okay. So now that I have a reference to this element, I can access the properties of that element through its reference. So I can say main E dot, and then remember, like all of those options that were listed in the browser, they're also listed here in the helper, right? So one thing is inner HTML. I can add additional HTML into this element, right? Or inner text. I can add some regular text that has nothing to do with HTML, just some text, right? I can access other things. So let's try and manipulate the content of my main element by adding inner HTML equals right? And then there, I just need to provide an HTML string. So h1, and then say hello world, and then h1 like this, right? So if I save this and go reload the page, here I have the words hello world appear in my main element, right? So here it is. Right now, my main element contains this h1, even though I don't actually have it in my HTML. So JavaScript was able to go into the document object model and add another node into the document object, right? There are other things that we can do. And so let's change the color of it, right? So we can add content, text, HTML. We can also change the way it looks. We have access to style from HTML, right? So we can do main e dot style, right? So style gives us access to all the CSS properties. And so if we want to change the background color, we'll say background color. So one thing to pay attention to is that while in CSS, background color spelled with a dash, so background dash lowercase c color, when you access that property in JavaScript, you use what's known as a camelback notation, which means that the first word would be lowercase and then all the subsequent words would be appended without any other symbols, without space, without underline, without dash, without anything, but they will be starting with uppercase letters, right? So background, uppercase C color, like this. And then we can set it to any value whatsoever. So one option I have is to use one of the CSS colors, but I can also add just RGB value, right? I can say RGB, let's say 180, and then 50 and 50, right? So it's kind of like a darker blue or a darker red color, sorry, right? So if we say that, save this, reload the page, here we have darker burgundy-ish type of red color. Okay. All right, fantastic. So now let's look at how we can start kind of like piecing some of this stuff together, right? And where the variables come into this, right? And how are they helpful? So we looked at how we can create variables. We looked at how we can add things together. We looked at how we can manipulate content on the page. Let's add a little script that will manipulate a little bit of content on the page for us. Okay, so I am going to create a script that is going to add random color to our main element, right? So every time you load a page, the background color of that element is going to be random. So let's start with this. I'm going to have 3 additional variables, right? I'm going to say let value r, right? So I'm going to have an r value, right? And that value is going to be a random value, right? So JavaScript includes a big component called math, right? Just like you can access your HTML document and do all kinds of stuff with it, issue commands to it, and manipulate the document object model. You also have a collection of math commands, right? Various things associated with typical math operations that you would want to do. And so one of them is generating a random number. So it's math.random, right? Math.random gives you a value between 0 and 1, right? This is very, very common because 0 and 1, this range between 0 and 1 is very helpful because it can be easily converted to a whole bunch of other ranges. So I know that my RGB values go between 0 and 255, right? So if I wanted to translate the range between 0 and 1 to the range between 0 and 255, all I have to do is just multiply the value by 255. And that's going to give me whatever that random value is, that's going to give me that similar value in the new range, right? So if I got 0.5 times 255 is going to be 127, right? Plus, decimal points. But the fundamentals are there, right? So if I get 1, it's going to be 255. If it's going to be 0, it's going to be 0, right? 0 times 255 is always 0, and so on. So we're going to do the same thing for the value of green, and we're going to do the same thing for the value of blue, right? So we generated some values. Let's look at them first before we do anything else. Let's console.log, right? And then remember, we can put different values together. So for example, it's a number, right? Or at least I expect it to be a number. The value of R, the value of G, the value of B, right? But I can concatenate it with a string. I can say something like red, right? And then red space, just so that I can separate the word from the actual value, and then add the value R appended to that. And then I can do the same thing with green, and I can do the same thing with blue, right? So let's see what happens when we run this. So I reload the page, go to the console. So the value for red is 60 with a lot of decimal points after that, right? So the value for green is 233, and the value for blue is 226. Those are perfectly usable numbers. You can include however many digits after decimal. Well, actually, not however many. You can't use infinite, but you can use decimal points when defining RGB colors. That is perfectly allowed, right? Or you can take these values, right, and just say just let's round them down, right? Instead of so if we got something like 60.708 whatever, right, let's round it down to 60. And if we got 233.470 and so on, let's round it down to 233, right? So to round it down, it's another math operation. So I'm going to say math dot floor, right? So that's called a floor operation. And so in the parentheses, I'm going to include the outcome of the previous operation. So I'm performing an operation, and then I'm passing the result of that operation into another operation, and then finally I'm going to take the result of all of it and store it in this variable, right? That's kind of what we're doing. I could store those results intermediately in the variables, but I don't have to. I can just pass them on right away and don't give them any names or labels, because I don't really care about those intermediate results, right? So if we save it this way, right, and run it again, right, we get a similar range of values, but now they don't have decimal points, which is all good. All right, so we have the value for red, green, and blue, and they're random, and every time you run it, you will see that the values are generated completely randomly. So now let's piece those things together. So now we need to take those values and we need to insert them into this statement, right? So where we had the words 180, or like the characters 1, 8, and 0, right? So remember, this is not a number. Since it has the quotation marks around it, this is actually a string of text. So this 1, 8, and 0 are not actually numbers. They're characters for 1, character for 8, and character for 0, right? But that's okay, because I can concatenate numbers and characters together, and the result will be a string of characters. We already saw this, right? So I need to replace this, I need to replace that, and I need to replace this with whatever the content of my value R, value G, and value B are, right? So before we start concatenating things, let's break it apart into pieces, and so that we can operate on those pieces separately. So I'm going to separate this 180 from everything else, right? And I'm going to say whatever was before it is going to be one piece, right? And then whatever goes after it is going to be another piece, right? And then 180 is going to be a thing on its own, but I'm going to add all those three components together. So it's going to say RGB parenthesis then 180, then comma, space, 50, comma, space, 50, closing parenthesis, right? So that's the idea. I'm going to save this. Let's just double check that it still works. And then it still does, right? Nothing's breaking. I don't have any errors. I just have values for the red, green, and blue continuously changing. That's fine. Right? And now I can take this value of 180 and replace it with value R, right? Let's spell it correctly. Save, and then reload. And you see that my shade of red is changing depending on what value of R I have, right? So if my value of R is very, very low, right, I get barely any red in this. So it's actually kind of like very dark gray, green, blue type of color, right? But if the value of R is really high, like this, right, I actually get like a reasonably bright red color. And I can do the same thing with all the other components. So I can remove this 50, right? And then say, okay, so I'm going to be adding value G over here. Again, it's just piecing little modules together. So RGB, open paren, is one module. Value R is the next module. The module after it is comma space, right? That I'm adding comma space. I don't need a space here, but you know, why not? So, and then I'm adding value G. And then the following module is going to be comma 050 closing parenthesis, right? So, and that 50 is going to be again replaced by another module, which is going to be value B, right? So I'm piecing together the string with the numbers, and we can see the effect if we save this, and hopefully everything is fine. So count your commas, count your plus signs, make sure that all of those pieces are all in place, right? So RGB, a number, then comma space, a number, then comma space, a number, and then the closing parenthesis. So let's save this, reload. And so every time I reload my page, it's going to be a completely different color, right? Because the numbers generated are completely different. All right. So that's one thing that you can do with JavaScript, right? You can generate random backgrounds, just an example. Okay, let's move on. It's kind of tedious to reload the page every time, and maybe even unnecessary. So instead of doing that, what if we create like a little interface, right? A little UI, and that would allow us to trigger little bits and pieces of JavaScript as needed. Okay, very common thing. So we're gonna add a button, and we're gonna trigger certain parts of JavaScript when we click on that button. So let's do this, right? I'm gonna change the height of my header. I think it's a little bit too large, right? I'm actually gonna remove it from my style, right? Only main and footer are gonna have a preset height because I'm gonna start adding some content into my header, and my header is gonna serve as my GUI container, right? So I'm gonna add a button, right? Button is an HTML document, an HTML element, and then I can say button, right? And then that button can have some kind of a name, right? Let's say random color, okay? And then last thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna give this button an ID, right? I'm gonna be referencing it in JavaScript, so I'm gonna need an ID to be able to reference. So I will call it color button, color BTN, okay? So let's just reload the page. So here we go, we have a random color, it's a button. It doesn't really do much, right? It just zooms the page for me, but any place where I click would zoom in. All right, so we have a button, and presumably when I click on it, I want the color to change, okay? All right, let's do it. So first, just like I referenced my main element, let's make a reference to a button, okay? So I'm gonna right here let CLR. Again, I want to try to kind of make different names for IDs and for the variables in JavaScript, just to highlight that it's not the same thing, right? I can't just like use the same or I can't just say color button and it will automatically be referenced in JavaScript. It has to be put into a variable as a reference first, right? So something like this, CLR button, and then that will be the reference to document dot get element by ID, and the ID is color BZN. Okay, so now I have this color button, and I need to say whenever I click, right, that statement in English needs to be translated into JavaScript. And so here's how we do it. JavaScript is what's known an event-based language. So what that means is that it doesn't constantly run, right? Which is kind of like an odd thing to say, but actually a lot of the programs just run on a loop, right? They're constantly doing something over and over and over again, even if you don't if it doesn't kind of give you any indication as a user that it's doing something, it is actually doing something over and over and over again, as fast as it can, or as fast as the resources allow it, or as fast as the programmer constrained it to run. And then JavaScript doesn't run like this. It actually operates on events. So when something happens, something else gets triggered, right? So I click a button, something goes, right? So even when we reload the page, that's actually an event. It's called window load event, right? So when the window loads its content, that event gets triggered, right? And so pretty much everything that you write in JavaScript will be tied to one or another type of event, right? So let's see. I like to add the event related content at the bottom of my script. So what I'm gonna say is CLR button dot add event listener, right? So it's going to have a component that's called an event listener. It's going to wait and listen for an event to happen. And that event that it's going to be listening to is going to be a click. So I'm going to say click. So it's going to, there are all kinds of events that can happen, right? We can potentially see like what some of the options would be, like close, copy, something is dragged, right? Or a mouse enter, or a keyboard key is pressed, right? So all of those are events. The piece of data is loaded, right? So all of those are events, and out of all of those, I'm just going to be listening to an event called click, which is just a mouse click, right? And when that event happens, I'm going to trigger some action or a collection of actions, right? And if you remember, a collection of actions is the words that I already used before, and I refer to a function that's already pre-written in JavaScript as a collection of actions, right? So this is what functions are. They're a collection of actions. Some of them are pre-written in JavaScript, and you can trigger them, or you can create your own functions, okay? So you can create your own collections of actions. Okay, so there are several ways of doing this. You can create functions on the fly. So let's see how that happens. So I can say comma and then function, right? So function requires parentheses, right? So that I can pass elements into the function. So for example, when we triggered function get element by ID, we passed in the ID of the element that we wanted to get, right, into that function. So any function would have this ability, but not every function requires something to be passed into it. So for example, function random in the math collection doesn't require anything to be passed into it. You can just call random, right? But functions have parentheses, and then if you want to specify what exactly that function needs to do, what is that collection of actions? What are the actions that the function needs to perform? you put that between the curly brackets, right? So I open and close the curly brackets, and then in between the curly brackets, I'm gonna take all of this stuff, everything that I've written here, right? So creating the random values, logging them out, and then finally assigning them to the background color property of the style of my main element, right? I'm gonna take all of these lines, cut them out, and then paste them to be the content of this function. Pay attention to indentation, just like with HTML and CSS. It's really helpful to keep the indentation neat, just so that you understand what code is a part of what other code, right? How they relate to each other. So if all these lines are a part of my function that will be triggered when the color button is clicked, then they should be indented, right? So that they can clearly be identified like this. But all right, let's save this. Okay. And then let's reload the page. So when the page loads, nothing runs, right? Because there is nothing in the main script. There are no commands that would make any kind of color, right? All of those commands are now a part of the function that will be triggered when I click on my button. So when I click on the button, that's when the color is generated. And then I have to click on it again and again and again and again. And I keep doing this. And you see the values are getting printed out and the colors are changing. And so I'm capturing this event and I am basically like making that code run whenever that event occurs. Okay, so fundamental functionality in JavaScript, right? This is how buttons work. So there are other things that you can do with buttons. Obviously, you can. So we saw changing the content in the main element. We saw changing the color of the main element. Let's look at loading images, right? So I have images, two Quokka images, this one and this one, JPEG and WebP, right, in my image folder, right? And so what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna create another button, and that's gonna set the image of my image element. So I'm gonna give it an ID. It's gonna be img btn, right? And then it's gonna be change. It's gonna say change image. Okay. I don't know why I'm adding exclamation points. It's not particularly necessary, but you know, here we go. So we have random color, right? Here we go. We can generate random color. I don't know why it's zooming. I don't want it to zoom. Can we not zoom? I think there is like a setting to prevent zooming. Nope. Okay, there we go. All right, so change image. So first of all, we need an image element, right? So inside my main element, I am going to add an img, right, image with some kind of a source, right? So that source is going to be, let's say, I want to load this quokka1.webp, right? So if you remember how to load an image from a certain location, I'm going to start on the level of my current file, which is js.examples.html, right? So I'm going to first find the folder called images, right? So images, and then I'm going to put in the name of the file that I'm looking for, right? So I'm going to give it an alt, Quokka, sure, whatever, it's a Quokka, and then ID equals main image. All right, so again, just like with the main element and the color button, I need to create references. So let's do that. Let image button, that reference is going to be to the element with an ID imgbtn, right? So we're going to say document.getElement by ID imgbtn. And then I am going to have let main I, right? Main image is going to be document.getElementById main img. Okay. All right. So I have both these references stored to the image that should be doing the displaying and the button that should be doing the changing. Okay, let's save this. Let's go to the page. Let's make sure nothing breaks, right? So we're not loading our image. Image source, images Squawka. Let's see. Let's reload. Main, it's actually not there. Why? Why is it not there? Very important thing. Notice that we say main.e.inner.html equals hello world. So we are literally saying all the inner HTML of my main element is now going to be this, right? And so if I comment out this line, if I remove this statement, now I have the image, right? So it replaces the inner HTML of my main element, which is image, with this content. Okay, so let's say I want to, let's say it's a problem. Obviously, I can just comment this out because this line is not super important to me, but let's say it's a problem for me. I actually want my JavaScript to start adding that component. So it requires a little bit of extra writing, but it's not super difficult to change. So rather than saying that is going to be the inner HTML of my main element, I now need to say, okay, so I want to create an H1 and I want to append it to my main element in such a way that it actually sits above the image. Okay, so let's say we want this, right? Let's say we're gonna create a new element first, right? So I'm gonna say something like this. Let new header equals document dot create element, and it's going to be an h1, right? So that's h1, right? So and then new header, right? So now I want to modify it, and then the text content dot text content is going to be hello world. Okay, so now I've created this as a separate element, but if we, let's comment this out, right? So if we run this, this element is not going to be anywhere on the page because while it exists as a part of the document, it hasn't been added to the body, it hasn't been added to the head, it hasn't been added to anything. It's just kind of like floats in ether, unattached. So what we need to do, we need to actually place it in the document object model structure, in the DOM structure, and make it a child of something or a parent of something, or somehow put it in our structure, right? So the final thing that we want to do is we need to say main e dot append child, okay? New header, right? So let's save this, reload, and here's our header, hello world, right? So great, fantastic. Since our header, by the way, now has its own content, we don't need to set its height to be 300 pixels, right? You see, like if I hover over main, you can see that it's just a rectangle with 300 pixels in it. It doesn't have to be. Let's zoom back out. Can we zoom back out? We'll zoom back out. So we don't need to set its content to be anything, but let's change our CSS over here to say that image is gonna have the maximum width of 100%, right? So that it doesn't spill out. Okay, save, reload. All right, so we have the image, we have the header, we have the two buttons. So now an interesting thing, an interesting conundrum, and see if you can just pause and kind of try and figure it out on your own. And then I'm going to show you how to first find the answer and then to apply the answer, right? But what if I want that hello world to go above the image, right? What if I want to change the order of these elements? How can I, what can I do? How can I do this, right? All right, pause, try to figure it out on your own. Google around, and I am going to show you how to find the answer and then show you how to apply the answer, right? So if you look at this append child, right, function, it takes that element that we've created, then it appends it at the bottom of its children structure, right? So remember how we talked about the children having the order when we talked about CSS, right? Like we had the last child. So basically it makes this element to be the last child. How can I make this element to be, let's say, first child, right? So let's find out first, what are some of the properties of append child, right? So I can say DOM append child. I'm just randomly Googling, right? So we have an append child method, right? And so you can read the description and sort of how it works and what are the requirements. And so one thing um, that is helpful with this documentation is that it has this see also content, right? And then it has a bunch of like additional things that you might want to explore, right? In relation to this particular functionality. So what it has here is a insert before. That looks promising. And then it also has element.append. Okay, so we can, let's look at quickly at element.append. It says that it's a method that inserts a set of node objects or strings after the last child of the element. The difference from append child is that it allows you to append strings, and it has no return value. And so like, not super promising. Maybe like I was hoping maybe it would give us like append as like nth child. Doesn't seem to be doing this. All right, so insert before though is an interesting thing, right? And so we can say that when we read this, it says that's a method that inserts a node before a reference node as a child of a specified parent node. Okay, so we have new node, a reference node, and then insert before. So let's look at the example. So we have a div with an ID parent element, a span with an ID child element, and so we created the element new node, right? So just like we did, and then we reference the parent, and then we say parent div dot insert before the new node, and then the second parameter that we're passing is the reference to the sp2, right? The child element here. So we have an extremely similar structure and we can replicate this, right? So instead of just saying append child, we need to say insert before. Insert before, right? And then we first pass what we want to insert and then before what. And we want to insert it before our main I, right? So because this is the reference to the main image in JavaScript that we have. So if you save this, let's save it, and then go back to our page, we actually insert our header before the image. All right, so that little problem is solved. Let's go back to changing the image. So now I'm going to add an event listener, right? Just like we did it for the control button, we are going to add another event listener for the image button. So let's say img button, add event listener, but I am going to add event listener, and that event is going to be, yes, a click. But I am going to show you a different way of triggering some functionality, and that is instead of creating this function on the fly, I'm going to create that function separately and trigger it from here. So I'm going to create a function called change image, right? And that's the function that's going to be triggered. Okay, so all of my event listeners go here, and then all of my functionality will be before. So I'm going to say function change image. So I actually misspelled it over here. That's important because then I would have an error, right? So change image, again, we need parentheses and we need the curlies, right? So here we are. So we need to first figure out what is the current image that we're trying to change, right? So we have this main I and it has an attribute source. So let's find out what's the source of our image. So console to the rescue, console log, and then main I dot src, right? So that's going to print out the source of our main image. Let's save this, reload, go to the console, and then we'll click change image, right? In order to trigger that function. Okay, so we have file, users, the whole file structure that fundamentally takes us to the images folder and then quokka1.webp, right? This is important because it shows you that even though I'm specifying it relatively, right? So relative to the file where I am right now, right? So relative to my js.examples file, the actual source that the browser is registering is the entire full path from the root of my computer. That's important, right? Same thing is going to happen on the web, right? Um, with your if your code is located somewhere on the web, right? So that's an important thing. But okay, so what do we need to say? We need to say basically that if we have Quokka 1 loaded, right? We want to load the image that's called Quokka2.jpg. Okay, so let's try and write this out. So the first thing is going to be the introduction to the if statements. So we have a condition here, right? And so we're going to start talking about conditionals. So if the source of my image is one thing, do X, right? So if main I dot src, right? And so there are a couple of ways to include this or to solve this. The easy way to solve it, well, not maybe like the most obvious, the most straightforward way is say main src is, and now we need to compare it to something, right? So if it is the same as something else, right? So we have a comparison operation, right? So JavaScript allows you to do several different comparison operations, right? Can say something is the same as something else, right? It can say something is greater than something else. Something is greater or equal to something else, right? So in order to say the same, right, we say either 2 equal points or equal sign or 3 equal signs. The reason for that is because we already use one single equal sign as an assignment operator. So it assigns a value to a variable, right? So a reference to an element to this variable, right? So if you want to do comparisons instead of assignments, you need to do either 2 or 3 equal signs. The difference between 2 and 3 equal signs is that 2 equal signs is a weak comparison, and 3 equal signs is a strong comparison. And again, getting a little technical, that means that 2 equal signs compares just the content, and 3 equal signs compares the content and type, right? So a quick illustration of that would be if I say 10 is equal to 10, like this, right? In quotation marks, it says true. 10 is 10, but the first one is a piece of numbers, right? It's a number 10, and the other one is a string, right? It's just two characters, 1 and 0. Even though the value is the same, the type is different, but we're using weak comparison, so it says value is the same, it's true. But 10, and if I use 3 equal signs, that's going to be false, right? So this is false because the 3 equal signs is comparison by both value and type, right? So while true is the same as 1, true is not the same as 1, right? So type and value, or just value. So typically, in the vast majority of cases, you want to use strong comparisons, right? It's very rare that you want to use a weak comparison, but it's there and now you know about it. Okay, so we can use the comparison, we can use the entire string, right? Because we printed it out and we can say, okay, so if my main source is equal to this whole thing, which is crazy, then we can do something, right? Not the ideal way. One of the reasons why it's not the ideal way is because the moment I put my document on GitHub, this whole thing is not going to be there, right? I'm going to be loading it with a different protocol from a different location, from a different server. That whole thing is going to go out the window, and it's actually going to be very difficult. Another thing we can do here, right? So this full comparison is no-go. So we can actually use a supplemental information. So we can say Quokka1, right? So if we have an image of quokka1.webp, our alt is going to say Quokka1. And then we can compare, instead of compare sources, we can use alt as an indicator. And we can say if it equals to Quokka1, then we can set the source and the alt to be, something else. And then finally, the third way, right? So totally valid, totally perfectly okay way of doing this, right? Just use a proxy. And then finally, the third way of doing this is say, if the source dot includes, so includes something. Okay, so let's look at what that means. Again, we can go to our JavaScript reference, right? And then maybe like here in the search, we can say includes, right? String.prototype includes. Okay, so includes is a method of string, right? So this is something that you can use when you're operating on strings. And since the source of an image is given as a string, then you can do that with a source. And it performs a case-sensitive search to determine whether a given string may be found within some other string. And then it returns true or false. So it says like, yes, this string includes some other substring, or it doesn't. Right, so here's an example. You have a sentence, quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, famous sentence, and does it include the word fox, right? And if it includes the word fox, which it does, it will return true. Fantastic. So same, we can look at the string that is the source of my image and say, does it include the file name Quokka1, right? And then, right? So what that tells you, another important thing, is that in the parentheses to the if statement, we want to put some kind of a true or false statement, right? So true or false thing. So comparison always returns true or false, right? Things are either the same or not the same, right? Or something is bigger than something else, or it's not bigger than something else, right? So the outcome of a comparison is always a true or false statement. And this is what the if condition is looking for, right? Same, this includes function will return a true or a false. And so we can use that to say if something, right? So if this, it's basically is equivalent to saying if the outcome of this is equal to true, right? But we can just skip it, right? Since it's already a true or false statement, and we can say something like main I dot source will now be equal to images slash Quokka 2 dot, and then remember Quokka 2 is actually a JPEG, right? So dot JPG. There we go. Okay. So excellent. So now let's save this, go back to our page, reload, and if we click on change the image, oh, includes is not a function. I made a spelling mistake. It should say includes. Okay. Again, reminder, read your error messages. Change the image. We change the image. Fantastic, right? So if I click it again, it's no longer going to do anything. Why? Because now the outcome of this statement is false. It doesn't include Quokka 1. And we can sort of double check it by adding a console.log statement, right? And saying changing to Quokka 2, right? Just to give ourselves a double check, right? Let's reload. So this is Quokka 1, change image. This is the image path, right? This is the source. We're changing to Quokka 2. Now I'm going to click it. It's going to give me the path again, but it's not going to be changing to Quokka 2. So what that tells you is that line 39 was executed, line 42 was not. Right? So here's line 39. We logged the source of the image, but when we went into the if statement, we checked, does the source now include the substring Quokka 1? The outcome was no, was false, and therefore we didn't do this. So the counterpart to the if statement would be the else statement, right? So if condition is true, do something, else do something else, right? So we can add the else option after the if. So we can say else like this, right? And then in the else statement, again, between the curly brackets, we can say console.log changing to Quokka 1, right? So else doesn't have any parentheses, right? Because it's always a counterpart of if, right? So if something is true, else the only other option is false, right? So you also have if, else if you have something that's other than just a true or false, right? If you have, like, let's say 3 options or 4 options and so on. But in our case, let's just focus on if and else. If condition is true, we do one thing, else we do another thing, right? And so we'll also set main I source back to images1.webp, right? So let's save this, reload, click once, change to Quokka 2, click twice, change back to Quokka 1, click again, change to Quokka 2, Quokka 1, Quokka 2, Quokka 1, and so on, and so on. And we have a little toggle switch. Change the background to random color and enjoy the fruits of your labor, right? So here's your super quick overview introduction to what JavaScript can do for you, right? Right, let's save this. A quick reminder, right? So we save this. We also need to make sure that we post this, push it to GitHub, right? So let's launch our GitHub desktop. So here we go, GitHub desktop. We have we added a file called js-examples.html, right? So let's add a commit, right? Added file with JavaScript examples, right? We're going to commit to main. We're going to push to origin. Okay, and then we can view it on GitHub. Here we go. Here is the JS examples file, right? And since my repository is published, I can easily access it, right? Go to settings, go to pages, visit the site, right? This is the main site. And then if I wanted to navigate to that specific file, right, examples.js, all I have to do is just copy the path to that file, right? And then append that path to the URL. And here's my toggling functionality, and here's my random color, and my page is working. Whew. Done. All right. So next video, I'm gonna also record how we can use our knowledge of JavaScript and create an automated gallery of images. A couple of new additional concepts in it, right? So hopefully you'll enjoy that one too. Hopefully you learned something here. See you in the next one. All right, bye.